I know Bentley kind of secondhand because um, approximately a million years ago, he and my wife Beth Ann went to Blair Summer School for Journalism together. We are both former journalists. While he was working for a newspaper in Virginia as a reporter, but also as a political cartoonist, an editorial cartoonist, he was challenged to create a series of historical comics. Now, Bentley has a degree from Harvard, where he studied history and also English in an honors program. So he's a pretty well accomplished historian as well as a cartoonist, and he's brought those things together in Chester Comix. And this is something that it's not all about the American history. Some of it is about other parts of history, but because it started in Virginia, Chester is a talking blue crab, Chesapeake Bay blue crab, pictured here, if you can see, as a hat. He wears a crab hat when he goes to Boy Scout events and things like that. When we were talking prior to this, we bonded a little bit over being, again, we were school children during the bicentennial of 1976. No, we don't go back to 1776. And that was also the time of Schoolhouse Rock. And I'm going to have to explain to some people what Schoolhouse Rock was. But it used to be that in between the Bugs Bunny and Roadrunner cartoons, they would come on and they would teach you a little bit of history. There were Schoolhouse Rock segments on math and grammar, conjunction, junction, what's your function? So my kids know them because we bought the box set of DVDs and subjected them to them. But Chester, he was explaining to me, is meant for kids who are a little bit older, who might be starting to ask some questions. And so when we get to the section of revolutionary rumblings, where the Declaration of Independence is signed, there are some people who step in from the sidelines, some little side characters who say, "What about women? What about slaves? All men are created equal. Very well and good." But overall, I think a relatively optimistic presentation of history and the progress that was made over time, even though it wasn't all there in the beginning. But Bentley can tell you much more. I've asked him to focus on the intersection of communication and democracy. And one of his main subjects for today will be Thomas Paine, who was the writer of a book called Common Sense, or a pamphlet actually called Common Sense, that was read and spoken about in the taverns and the coffee houses and helped build support for the American Revolution. With that, I'm going to turn it over to Bentley Boyd to take us from 1776 to 2026.
Good morning, everyone. I do apologize for being late. I used to be a newspaper carrier before I was a newspaper reporter, and I got up plenty of mornings much earlier than this, but I'm apparently out of practice. Thank you very much for that introduction, David. That was wonderful, and I am steeped in history. It was a wonderful opportunity when newspapers still had the capacity to do such things, to be given the chance to go from drawing political cartoons about current events, things like the president and the governor, to doing things, well, that were old political cartoons. And so I've been doing this work for 30 years. And of course, Virginia has a lot of tourism and economy surrounded by history. And when we had the 150th anniversary of the Civil War about 15 years ago, my son and I actually were reenactors. So we were given a chance to dress and to live that history. But at that time in 2010, 2011, 2012, it was still very clearly we are reenacting something that happened a long time ago, right? There was no confusion about uh, it mixing with current events in 2011 and 2012. What I find fascinating now at the 250th anniversary of the American Revolution is that all of the issues that they discussed in 1775, 1776 are alive today. They are in the headlines today. We are discussing them with our friends and on social media today. And one of my favorite examples, before we get to 1776, is a Virginian named Patrick Henry. Now, if you know anything about Patrick Henry, you probably know that he stood up at one point and said, "Give me liberty or give me death." The context and the story about when and how he says that, I think, actually teaches us a lot about how we can live in our democracy in 2026. He doesn't just get up and say that out of the blue. He is making choices that lead to the revolution, and they're very similar to the choices that I think we all face today. Now, with that, let's test how good my technology is. I would like to share my screen so that I can show you some of the story as I discuss the story. And it's not letting me click through. How about that? Let's see here. There we go. All right, can everyone see that cartoon?
Do you want to put it into presentation mode? Because we're just seeing the authoring tool.
You should be seeing my drawing of the Capitol in Colonial Williamsburg. Can you see that?
There we go.
Yes.
Yep.
All right, so this moment is actually in 1765. Patrick Henry is a young man. He's only 29 years old when he is first elected to go to the Representative Assembly in Williamsburg, Virginia. He's from the frontier. He is the child of an immigrant. One of the businesses he tried to run as a young man, a tavern, actually failed. And his education, his formal education, ended when Patrick Henry was only about 10 years old. But everybody knows he's a very smart person, and he's already an outspoken person on the issues of the day. And in 1765, they elect him from the frontier of Virginia to go to Williamsburg. And you can see from my rather crude drawing that Williamsburg at that time is very important in the 13 colonies. It has beautiful architecture because it is the largest in terms of land mass of all the 13 colonies. It has the most people among all the 13 colonies, and among the 13 colonies, it is the wealthiest because of all of its tobacco production. So when Patrick Henry shows up for the legislative session in 1765, the Stamp Act is the topic of the day because Britain wants to raise taxes on the colonists to pay for the French and Indian War that was recently won. And Patrick Henry goes to the big city of Williamsburg at age 29. And within 10 days, they find that the Stamp Act has been passed, and he stands up to make a speech. He could just sit in the back and be quiet, but he stands up at age 29 and begins to reference other dictators in history. For Caesar had his Brutus, King Charles I had his Cromwell, and King George III, may learn from their example. And the old leaders in that legislative body cry out, "Treason! How dare this young man stand up and criticize the king for levying this stamp tax?" And Henry, quick on his feet, as any good Toastmaster should be, says, "If this is treason, let us make the most of it." And he introduces resolves that are really one of the first expressions of what will show up later in the Declaration of Independence. But this is a decade before Jefferson puts his quill to paper. Patrick Henry introduces resolves that assert that we should not have taxation without representation. And when those pass out of the Virginia General Assembly, they get reprinted in newspapers up and down the coast, and they spark protests against the Stamp Act. He is one of the first politicians who says words about ideas that are so powerful that they get communicated in print form to people in other colonies hundreds of miles away. And his words have effect. They actually do cause protests. The mobs come out, they intimidate some of the royal people who are supposed to collect the tax, and Britain backs down and pulls back on the Stamp Act. But as we know, they keep trying other taxes. So the issues only grow from there. We get to a point in 1775 where the Boston Tea Party has happened. In Virginia, there is sympathy for the colonists in Boston. They say, let's have a day of Thanksgiving and remembrance for our brethren in Boston. And the royal governor becomes furious that they would show sympathy for this rabble. So he disbands the assembly. He literally says, you may not meet in Williamsburg anymore. You are not representatives of the king's colony. So they go to this church. In this panel, this church still stands today. You can visit it in Richmond, Virginia. These politicians made a choice, and Patrick Henry is among them. Rather than simply go back to their homes and close their front door and hope that this would all blow over, they defy the royal government by taking their business and their group from Williamsburg to this tiny church in Richmond, which at that point is still a frontier community. But it's important to them at this point in 1775 that they stand with people who are living and making choices about these big ideas about taxation and representation, freedom. How do we organize our society so that it is equitable, it is fair? And they do this in defiance of the existing government. Well, of course, Patrick Henry is going to stand and make a speech here. At this point, he's been a representative for a decade, and he believes very strongly in the ideas that he's been expressing for that decade. He stands up and he is very clear-headed about the fact that in Boston, the king has closed the port until the rabble pay for the tea that they dumped in the Boston Tea Party. And here's Patrick Henry, hundreds of miles away, telling his fellow Virginians, our chains are forged. Their clanking may be heard on the plains of Boston. War is inevitable, and let it come. This is February 23rd of 1775, and rarely in American history has a politician been this right in making a prediction. February 23rd of 1775 is just a few weeks before the shot heard round the world will happen at Lexington and Concord. But here is Henry ahead of the curve, telling people it's not time to sit on the sidelines. It's not time to be quiet. One of the things that you might have heard somebody say in 2026 is, if you comply, you will not die. Well, Patrick Henry believes the opposite. He believes that there is a time when you must stand for your principles, and here, in this tiny church in Richmond, Virginia, he is doing that. What is it that gentlemen wish? What would they have? Is life so dear or peace so sweet as to be purchased at the price of chains and slavery? Forbid it, Almighty God. I know not what course others may take, but as for me, Give me liberty or give me death. It doesn't get any simpler than that choice. And what impresses me about Patrick Henry, among the founding fathers, is that he actually lived that choice. Lexington and Concord happens, and he is a militia leader in his neighborhood on the frontier of Virginia. So a militia is a group of volunteers who say that in times of emergency, we will leave our homes, we will bring our own guns, our own gunpowder, our own supplies, but we will gather together to defend our community. And he is the leader in the Hanover County militia. The same royal governor who had disbanded the political grouping of Virginians has redcoats steal the gunpowder that is stored in a public building in Williamsburg. And this is all happening at the same time that the redcoats were trying to get the gunpowder at Lexington and Concord. That's why the redcoats were there. But in Virginia, the governor is successful. He steals the gunpowder, and without gunpowder, of course, the resistance can't fight for very long. So there's a big discussion. George Washington leads a militia, and there's all this back and forth in between the militia leaders who are sort of hovering, waiting to see what to do next, and the royal governor. And the royal governor is actually able to convince George Washington in April of 1775 to stand down. George does not lead his militia against the capital, but Patrick Henry does. Patrick Henry's militia in Hanover County feels differently. They mean to make us into slaves. If we unite in the cause of liberty, we are invincible. And he goes to the capital and he intimidates the governor so much that the governor pays for the gunpowder. And Patrick Henry says, I will deliver this money to the Second Continental Congress in Philadelphia to pay for gunpowder for the people who are already fighting against the redcoats directly in Boston. The governor, this is the royal governor, Lord Dunmore, actually puts out a bounty, or we today might say a warrant for Patrick Henry's arrest. Says, I give this executive order that no one may help Henry leave this colony for Philadelphia. If any of this is sort of striking a chord with the headlines that you're reading in 2026, well, there's a reason for that. And so Patrick Henry, once again, has a choice. Does he stand down? Does he play it safe? Does he go back to his home and remain quiet? Or does he act on the idea? And Patrick Henry rides to Philadelphia. It turns out that the people along the way help him. They don't follow the executive order from the executive power in Virginia. And when he gets to Philadelphia, he turns over the money, and the Second Continental Congress begins to levy war against the king's troops. From there, yes, we do get to a standoff in Boston. We have a long period in which the politicians in the Second Continental Congress are unsure about how far to wage the war. And then it is another immigrant, as David said, Thomas Paine was a dirty immigrant journalist in Philadelphia who is running a journal, and he's trying to report on the things from Lexington and Concord, but he realizes that just having periodic articles is not enough. And so in the fall of 1775, just a few months after the panels that I showed you, Thomas Paine puts together a really comprehensive idea of why we're fighting the redcoats. But he does it in language that is very plain and very bold. In other words, he takes the way Patrick Henry acts as an orator, as a speaker, and he puts it onto the printed page. Paine is just as bold as Henry, but he's doing it in print, which of course makes it much easier to share the ideas. Thomas Paine's Common Sense comes out in January of 1776 and lights a fire among all of the people up and down the coast who were still waiting in the middle, not sure which way to go. Should we remain loyal to the king, or should we take up arms and risk everything, as people like Patrick Henry had demonstrated could be done? Common Sense was such a viral sensation that it went through many, many printings, but was also read aloud. This is one of the things that fascinates me about this moment in our American history, that there were varying levels of literacy, of course, and people who had copies of Common Sense would go to their local tavern, and much as we are gathered here today, someone would stand up and read this pamphlet to people who may not have had the money to buy it on their own or had the literacy to read it on their own. And that was a powerful way to broaden these ideas, in a small tavern in upstate New York, far from where Patrick Henry would be making his speeches, far from the seat of royal government, far from where the guns were already out in Boston. And that's how we built a groundswell history from the bottom up of people making choices that, yes, now was the time to stand up for principles that they hoped would live long after the shooting stopped. And they were right. Thank you.